My name is Jenny Roberts. I'm a settler of color in Amiskwaciwaskahikan, also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory, Alberta, Canada. I'm reading from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Executive Summary Report, the section titled Canada's Public Commemoration Initiative, pages 335 to 339. The Commission takes note of the federal government's own National Commemoration Initiative, which was described as, quote, an expression of reconciliation, end quote, when it was publicly announced at the Atlantic National event in 2011. It is a specially commissioned stained glass window entitled Gani Gani Mananing, or Looking Ahead, designed by Métis artist Christy Belcourt. Its two-sided imagery depicts the history of the residential schools, the cultural resilience of Aboriginal peoples, and hope for the future. The window was permanently installed in the center block of the Federal Parliament buildings and unveiled in a dedication ceremony on November 26, 2012. Putting this window in such a prominent public place helps to make the history and legacy of residential schools more visible to the Canadian public and the world at large, while also acknowledging the federal government's responsibility in establishing the residential school system. At the dedication ceremony, artist Christy Belcourt said that her inspiration for the window's design came from the survivors themselves. She said, "The stories of residential school students were never told in this building, so I'm going to tell you one now. I asked Lucille Kelly Davis, who is a residential school survivor, what she wanted to see on the window. I had assisted her through the residential school settlement process, and like so many survivors, her story is horrific. Despite her childhood, she married, had 4 children, and now has many grandchildren. She is a pipe carrier, attends traditional ceremonies, and helps younger people learn the traditions. She's a powerful Anishinaabe grandmother who is generous, loving, and caring, and gives all she can to her community and her family. She is not a victim, but a survivor. When I asked her what to put on the window, she said, quote, 'Tell our side of the story,' end quote. She said, 'Make it about hope.' It's about looking ahead, as the name of the window says, Gani Gani Mananing, looking to the future for those yet unborn. Because she told me to make it about hope, what I've tried to show in the design is all the positive things I've seen in my life. Despite residential schools, children, adults, and elders dance in full regalia in celebration of who they are as Indigenous people. We see Métis youth learning fiddling and jigging with pride across the country. We see arenas full of Inuk elders drum dancing with little kids running around speaking Inuktitut. We see whole communities come together in times of joy and in times of grief. The lodges are growing, with traditional songs being sung. The ceremonies are being taught, and the ceremonies are still practiced. I wish I could show the government that reconciliation has the power to be so much more. I wish I could convince them that reconciliation is not an unattainable goal if there's the will and the courage to discard old paternalistic ways of thinking and behavior. We need action, and where we need action, don't meet us with silence. Where we need support, don't accuse us of being a burden. I wish I could speak to the hearts of MPs, whether Conservative or NDP or Liberal, and let them know that renewal and reconciliation can be found between Aboriginal peoples and the rest of Canada through the sustained wellness of generations of Aboriginal people to come. At Commission hearings, we heard from many survivors about windows. We heard from those who looked out from the school windows, waiting and hoping to see their parents come for them, those who cried when no one came for them, especially when it was Christmas or another holiday. We heard from those who were told, sometimes being pulled away from the window by the hair to get away from that window, or, your parents are not coming for you anyway. We heard from those who simply looked out into the dark or into the distance, crying because they were so lonesome and homesick. Windows were also a beacon of hope. Survivors also told us how they smiled and laughed and couldn't contain the tears of joy when they looked out the window and saw their parents or grandparents coming to visit them or take them away from the school. The windows of the residential schools evoked both good and bad memories for survivors. Thus, a commemorative window seems a fitting monument to remember and honor the children who went to residential schools. Commemorations in highly visible public spaces such as the Parliament buildings create openings for dialogue about what happened, why, and what can be learned from this history. Through dialogue, citizens can strengthen their ability to, quote, accommodate difference, acknowledge injustice, and demonstrate a willingness to share authority over the past, end quote. In the context of national reconciliation, ongoing public commemoration has the potential to contribute to human rights education in the broadest sense. Although Canada's commemorative window was a significant gesture of reconciliation, the Commission believes that the federal government must do more to ensure that national commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools becomes an integral part of Canadian heritage and national history. Under the Historic Sites and Monuments Act of 1985, the minister responsible for Parks Canada has the authority to designate historic sites of national significance and approve commemorative monuments or plaques. The minister is advised by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada on the commemoration, quote, on the commemoration of nationally significant aspects of Canada's past, including the designation of national historic sites, persons, and events, end quote. The board reviews and makes recommendations on submissions received from Canadian citizens who make nominations through the National Program of Historical Commemoration. Heritage sites, monuments, and plaques that celebrate Canada's past are common, but commemorating those aspects of our national history that reveal cultural genocide, human rights violations, racism, and injustice are more problematic. As we noted earlier, at the international level, the Joynet-Arentlicher principles adopted by the United Nations have established that states have a responsibility to take measures to ensure that collective violence against a targeted group of people does not reoccur. In addition to providing compensation, making apologies, and undertaking educational reform, states also have a duty, quote, to remember, end quote. Under Principle 2, a people's knowledge of the history of its oppression is part of its heritage and as such must be preserved by appropriate measures in fulfillment of the state's duty to remember. On a collective basis, symbolic measures intended to provide moral reparation, such as formal public recognition by the state of its responsibility or official declarations aimed at restoring victims' dignity, commemorative ceremonies, naming of public thoroughfares, or the erection of monuments help to discharge the duty of remembrance. In 2014, the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Farida Shahid, issued a report on memorialization processes in countries where victims and their families, working collaboratively with artists and various civic society groups, have commemorated their experiences in unofficial ways that may run counter to state-sanctioned versions of national history. Shahid observed that the commemorations of Indigenous peoples' experience, both their oppression and their positive contributions to society that have occurred in many countries, including Canada, have not been state-driven initiatives. Rather, they have been initiated by Indigenous peoples themselves. In Canada, this is a quote, "In Canada, our memorial to Indigenous veterans from the First World War was built at the request of Indigenous peoples, integrating many elements of Indigenous cultures. This recognition took place at a later stage in history, however, and in a different venue to the main memorial established for other Canadian soldiers. Commemoration projects are also taking place regarding the history of Indian residential schools." The report concluded that state authorities have a key role to play in the commemoration process. The state is responsible for managing public space and has the capacity to maintain monuments and develop long-term national commemoration policies and strategies. The Special Rapporteur further concluded that states should ensure that memorial policies contribute to, in particular, providing symbolic reparation and public recognition to the victims in ways that respond to the needs of all victims oppressed in a recent or distant past and contribute to their healing. The development of reconciliation policies between groups and promoting civic engagement, critical thinking, and stimulating discussions on the representation of the past, as well as contemporary challenges of exclusion and violence. End quote. The report recommended that states and relevant stakeholders, quote, promote critical thinking on past events by ensuring that memorialization processes are complemented by measures fostering historical awareness and support the implementation and outreach of high-quality research projects, cultural interventions that encourage people's direct engagement in educational activities, States should ensure the availability of public spaces for a diversity of narratives conveyed in artistic expressions and multiply opportunities for such narratives to engage with each other. States must also take into consideration the cultural dimension of memorial processes, including where repression has targeted Indigenous peoples." End quote.